I think my mother did exactly the right thing. I think it's absolutely extraordinary.
27 years after the tragic death of Princess Diana, Buckingham Palace has just unearthed a secret that could bring the monarchy to its knees. During some quiet renovations at Kensington Palace, a sealed room was uncovered, a space left completely untouched since Diana's final days. Inside, they found an ornate jewellery box engraved with a chilling message for anyone who dares to seek the truth. When Princess Anne is assigned to catalogue the items, what starts as a simple royal duty descends into a shocking revelation of betrayal, cover-ups and danger. There were hidden letters, secret banks, and Diana's own confessions pointing to a massive conspiracy she was about to expose. But someone made certain she never had the chance. As Anne gets closer to the truth, one question starts to scream louder than all the others. Who was it that really silenced the people's princess? Subscribe, like and share as we follow Anne's transformation from a loyal royal into a rebel demanding justice. The secret Diana died protecting might finally be revealed, the unexpected inheritance. In the spring of 2024, renovation crews started work on the quieter wings of Kensington Palace. What was supposed to be just a structural update to one of the oldest parts of the estate soon became something else entirely. Tucked behind a sealed wooden panel and under layers of dust, workers found a forgotten room, small, silent and untouched since the late Princess Diana's last days. It was like a time capsule. When the news finally reached Buckingham Palace, it was Princess Anne who got the call. As the most senior working royal, known for her strong sense of duty and her discretion, she was the obvious person to oversee the cataloguing of whatever was in that room. Anne had always kept her distance from the whirlwind of royal drama, but she couldn't deny the importance of this discovery. As she stepped inside the room, the silence was what struck her first. Dust covered everything: elegant evening gowns, boxes filled with handwritten notes, and photos of a woman whose life had been both worshipped and relentlessly torn apart. When it came to Diana, Anne's feelings for her late sister-in-law had always been complicated. At first she thought Diana was too fragile, too emotional, and way too desperate for the spotlight. But over the years away from the cameras and behind closed doors, Anne saw Diana's fierce love for her sons and her causes. There were quiet, unspoken moments when Anne truly respected her. She was surrounded by thousands of items, but only one thing truly caught her attention. It was an ornate jewellery box sitting on a shelf, partly hidden under a silk scarf. This box was completely different from everything else in the room. It was intricately carved from dark rosewood, with delicate pearl and sapphire inlays, and it seemed to glimmer under the dust. The craftsmanship was incredible, but it had a different energy. It felt intimate, deeply private. Anne picked it up, her brow furrowed with curiosity. It felt surprisingly heavy in her hands, as if it held more than just pieces of jewellery. She turned it over and over, examining every fine detail, and then she found it an inscription faintly etched into the base of the lid, as if it were never meant to be seen. For those who dare seek truth, DS. Those initials sent a cold shiver down Anne's spine. Diana Spencer, not the Princess of Wales, just her own name. It was personal. It was defiant. Anne scanned the room one more time, but now, with new eyes. Had Diana left something more than just expensive gowns and trinkets? What truth was she even talking about? Why hide such a strange message inside something so beautiful? Clutching the box, Anne had a feeling this wasn't just some ordinary inheritance. It felt more like a puzzle, a hidden message, and maybe even a warning. Whatever was inside this box was meant for someone brave enough to look past the surface. Someone who, perhaps too late, wished she had asked more questions when she had the chance. The hidden compartment? Princess Anne was all alone in her private study, the jewellery box laid out on a velvet cloth in front of her. She had carefully polished its surface, but her eyes kept returning to that inscription over and over again. For those who dare seek truth, DS. Those words just wouldn't leave her alone. Anne wasn't one for melodrama, but something about the message tapped into her sense of duty, and something else she couldn't yet name. With a steady hand, she slowly lifted the lid. The contents inside were absolutely breathtaking. Nestled within were earrings made of rare Burmese rubies, a sapphire bracelet that sparkled like the night sky, and an emerald and diamond pendant so perfectly cut it seemed to glow. But as Anne started to examine each piece, she began to notice something was off. Etched into the back of every item were tiny markings, symbols, dates, and initials that didn't match any royal records she knew of. She pulled out a magnifying glass and studied the strange markings up close. Some of them looked like coordinates. Others seemed like references. Maybe they were case numbers or important dates. One brooch was even engraved with a number that looked just like an international bank code. She frowned. These were not sentimental mementos. They were clues, a trail of breadcrumbs. She shifted her focus back to the box itself. Her fingers ran instinctively over the grooves and panels, her mind trying to trace the expert craftsmanship. Then, whether by accident or by fate, her thumb happened to press against a slightly raised section near the base. A soft click echoed in the silence, and the bottom panel moved just a tiny bit. Anne froze, holding her breath, then slid the panel completely open. There was a second compartment, shallow but packed full. It held a small bundle of handwritten letters. The ink was faded but still readable, all tied together with a pale blue ribbon. They had a faint smell of lavender, and underneath the letters was a small stack of glossy photographs showing Diana clearly in disguise meeting with people Anne had never seen before. The backgrounds were unfamiliar too. They were meeting in cafes, dark underground parking garages and private homes. None of this fit with the public life the Princess of Wales was famous for, and tucked beneath the photos was one small silver key. On its tag was written Zurich Deposit Box 837L. Anne just stared at it, completely stunned. Her heart began to pound as she turned her attention back to the letters. Her own name was written in Diana's familiar looping handwriting on the very first envelope to Anne. Please read if I am gone. The date, written in the corner, was absolutely chilling. It was just 3 days before Diana's tragic death in Paris. Anne sat down heavily, her hands now trembling slightly. She carefully unfolded the first letter. The ink had smudged in a few places as if it had been written in a desperate rush. Her eyes fell on the very first line and she froze. And if you're reading this, then they succeeded in silencing me. The room seemed to spin for a second. This wasn't about sentiment, and it wasn't about drama. This was a direct warning from beyond the grave. Anne closed her eyes, trying to take a deep breath. Whatever truth Diana had managed to uncover was now in her hands, and it was clear someone had gone to extreme lengths to ensure it stayed buried forever. Diana's final confession. The letter shook slightly in Princess Anne's hand, but her gaze was like steel. Diana's elegant handwriting filled the entire page, but it was urgent, the letters slanting forward, as if racing against the clock. Anne read on her breath, catching as the affectionate tone suddenly turned grave. Diana started by remembering a charity gala back in 1995, the very night she first suspected something was deeply wrong. A respected children's foundation, one she had poured her heart into, had failed to send funds to its overseas programs. When she quietly demanded answers, she got nothing but evasions, cooked books, and eventually threats. The deeper she investigated, the more corruption she uncovered. Anne turned the page and saw a spreadsheet in Diana's own hand, filled with meticulously copied numbers, bank transfers, and anonymous accounts. According to Diana's notes, money intended for landmine survivors. Children's hospitals and shelters for women had been siphoned into personal accounts. Some belonged to powerful businessmen, others, more chillingly, had ties to figures inside the royal household. In the letter, Diana's voice seemed to grow colder, more determined. She wrote of secret late-night meetings with investigative journalists, one from France and another from Switzerland, who were already sensing a much larger conspiracy. She talked about code names, dead drops, and constant surveillance. She had even started to record her conversations, hiding the tapes in secret locations. Whistleblowers terrified for their lives had come to her in secret, offering documents and their testimony. Anne sank back into her chair, her heart pounding. She had never ever imagined Diana was capable of orchestrating an operation like this. For years she saw her as impulsive, compassionate certainly, but reckless. But this was anything but reckless. This was a strategy. This was a woman who knew predators were circling, documenting every move, because she knew she could be their next target. Diana's writing softened in the parts of the letter where she spoke about William and Harry. "I am not afraid to die," she had written, "but I am afraid for them of the legacy they'll be forced to inherit if this truth is buried with me." Anne blinked away unexpected tears. She had completely misjudged Diana. The last months of her life were not just defined by scandal and sorrow. They were a race against time to expose the truth, a desperate mission to protect her sons from shadowy forces manipulating the crown itself. As she reached the last page, Anne's fingers froze over a single underlined sentence right at the bottom. "If you find this, Anne, then know I left a final insurance policy. Everything is hidden away in a Swiss bank vault." She looked down at the small key from the hidden compartment, which now felt so much heavier. The truth Diana had died to protect was not lost. It was waiting buried beneath mountains, shielded by silence and secrecy. And someone else besides her was almost certainly searching for it. The Swiss connection. The private jet landed in Zurich, concealed by the early morning fog. Princess Anne travelled with no fanfare, no aides, and absolutely no explanation. Only her closest security team knew where she was, and even they had been given a completely misleading itinerary. The key Diana left was tucked securely inside her coat pocket, resting over her heart like a heavy weight of obligation. The Swiss bank was discreet, ancient, and catered to clients who valued silence above all else. Anne presented the key and the tag marked with the number 837L. Her voice was calm, though her heart hammered in her ears. The bank clerk just glanced at her, ID nodded without a hint of recognition, and then led her through layers of security, each colder and quieter than the last. Inside a secure viewing room, a box was placed in front of her. Anne held her breath for a moment, then she opened it. Stacks of documents filled her vision. Ledgers, receipts, and financial transfers, all meticulously organised. There were colour-coded folders and photographs, and every single one was labelled in Diana's unmistakable handwriting. But the most chilling things of all were the tapes and digital discs tucked away at the bottom. Each was marked with a date and a subject. One simply read, "If I disappear." Anne slid the first disc into the player. The screen flickered on, and there she was, Diana, sitting in what looked like a private flat, her face bare eyes, tired but piercingly focused. She began to speak in a firm, clear voice. "If you are watching this, then it means I have been silenced. But I want you to know what I found and why I simply could not walk away." Anne leaned in close as Diana started naming names. Not just anonymous businessmen or foreign investors, but members of the aristocracy men who smiled in press photos and hosted lavish charity balls. Diana laid out how they used charities as financial fronts, moving millions of dollars to fund arms deals, offshore accounts, and other secret operations. She had tried to warn officials. Some listened, but others just told her to back off. She described how she started to fear the brakes on her own car had been tampered with, and how she no longer trusted her own security detail. She explained how she moved through back entrances and coded her calls. Her eyes filled with tears when she mentioned William and Harry. "I have to leave them something more than fairy tales," she whispered. "They need the truth." Anne sat there frozen as the video ended. Her stomach was in knots. This was so much bigger than she could have ever imagined. An international network tangled up with the very institutions meant to protect the public. Diana hadn't been paranoid. She had been right, and she had paid the ultimate price for it. She turned to the bank clerk who was waiting outside. His expression was a blank slate, but his words made her heart stop. "You're not the first to ask about this box," he said quietly. "Someone else came by about 2 weeks ago. They claimed they were family." Anne's fingers gripped the key tighter. The race had officially begun, and she wasn't the only one with pieces of the truth. Surveillance begins. Princess Anne returned to London filled with a silent, heavy purpose. The discovery in Switzerland had shaken her to her very soul. Diana hadn't just been watching and exposing a conspiracy, she had been hunted. Anne had the evidence locked in a guarded vault in a private residence far from any royal properties. But what she didn't know as her plane landed at Heathrow was that someone was already watching her every move. The first sign was very subtle. Her personal phone, the one she used just for family, began to click and echo strangely during calls. Then her mail began arriving late with letters that had clearly been opened and resealed. Her car, always kept in perfect condition, suddenly wouldn't start in her secure garage. A mechanic later found a severed brake line, dismissing it as damage from rodents. But Anne was no fool. She brought in an old friend, a retired agent from British intelligence, to sweep her entire home and all her devices. He found exactly what she feared: traces of tracking malware on her phone and bugs hidden away in her study. Someone was absolutely listening. Someone knew she possessed Diana's evidence, and they were desperate to find out what she planned to do with it. It was during this rising tide of paranoia that a mysterious package arrived with no return address. Inside was just a single name, Timothy Radcliffe, who was Diana's former private secretary. Anne remembered him clearly, a quiet man, fiercely loyal, who simply vanished from public life right after Diana's death. She managed to track him to a modest house just outside Bath, and he agreed to meet her at night in a small chapel known to only a handful of people. In the dim candlelight, Timothy's face looked as if it were carved from years of silence. He didn't waste any time. "Your sister-in-law was not alone in this," he said. "She trusted a few of us people she knew had no real stake in the machine. We've kept watch all this time waiting for someone brave enough to carry on her work." Anne sat there in total stunned silence as Timothy laid it all out. The official investigation into Diana's death had been absolutely riddled with holes. Evidence was conveniently ignored, witnesses were effectively silenced. CCTV footage from that night in Paris went missing, and all reports of the white Fiat seen at the crash were dismissed without any good reason. It was never meant to be solved, he told her, just quietly put to bed. The enormous weight of his words pressed down on Anne's shoulders. Diana had died while she was chasing the truth. And now Anne, by stepping into that same shadow, had become the brand new target. She returned home later that night to find an envelope slid under her front door. The handwriting wasn't familiar, and the message was brutally short: "Stop digging or join her." Anne stared at the threat, her fingers trembling just slightly. The message was clear, but what they failed to grasp was that fear had never been a motivating factor in her life. And now that she knew what Diana died trying to expose retreat was simply not an option. The ghost of her sister-in-law was no longer just a whisper from the shadows. She was practically roaring from the grave, and Anne would be damned if she let her be silenced again. It was time to expose the network. Days blurred into nights as Princess Anne went underground, sifting through Diana's collection of evidence like an archaeologist, unearthing a lost civilization. The banking documents from Switzerland, the personal letters from Diana, and the quiet testimony of old allies all painted a picture that was far too grim to ignore. Diana had not just accidentally stumbled into danger. She had actually uncovered a global operation rooted in royal privilege, one that was cloaked behind the perfect veil of charity and humanitarianism. Anne started compiling timelines, matching up names and tracing the money trails. The deeper she dug into the cover-up, the clearer the horrifying picture became. Diana's well-publicized global work, her landmine campaign, her visits to war zones and refugee camps had unknowingly put her on the front lines of something far more sinister and deadly. Behind all the photo ops and the glowing press coverage, certain shadowy figures had been using royal movements as a perfect distraction. They were conducting illegal arms deals and laundering illicit money across borders. But what hit Anne the hardest was the deep betrayal. Diana had actually trusted these people. She had laughed with them at dinners, spoken highly of them in interviews, and even defended them in the press. Yet some of them were part of the very machine that was working to destroy her. Hidden among the financial reports were major transactions authorised by people within the palace's own inner circle. Anne immediately began to cross-reference accounts, foundations, and private travel records. One name started to surface again and again. It was someone whose public image had always been flawless. Someone Anne would never have suspected. A relative by blood. She felt physically sick. Anne contacted Timothy Radcliffe one more time. Together they confronted one of Diana's old friends from the Red Cross, who, after much resistance, finally confirmed what Anne had feared all along. Diana had been on the absolute brink of releasing a joint exposé with a journalist right before she died. It was a bombshell report that would have implicated not just powerful businessmen, but also high-ranking members of the royal family and major government contractors. That report was never published. The journalist was discovered dead only weeks after Diana, from what they called an overdose. Another case closed. In the final stack of files, Anne discovered a hidden folder labelled Operation Marionette. It contained correspondence between foreign security agents and a private security firm that had been previously hired to monitor and deter Diana's movements. The very last page included a single chilling instruction: ensure containment before Paris trip. Risk elevated. Anne's breath hitched in her throat. She followed the breadcrumbs one step further until she found the final piece of the puzzle, a grainy surveillance photo that had never been made public. It showed the tunnel in Paris just moments before the devastating crash. The infamous white Fiat was clearly visible, but just behind it was a second car, unidentified and never mentioned, with plates that traced back to a company linked to a known associate of a royal family staffer. Her hands trembled. This was no longer speculation. This was solid confirmation. The crash had not been some tragic accident. It had been carefully staged, and the people behind it were not only alive, they were still powerful, still protected, and still watching. Anne stood motionless in the silence of her study, her hand resting on the damning photograph. Diana had been mercilessly hunted, and now the hunter's scent was fresh again, leading to an emotional collapse. Her study was silent save for the quiet crackling of the fireplace. Princess Anne just sat there completely alone. The mountain of evidence was spread all around her like the broken fragments of a life everyone had overlooked. The photo of Diana, so happy and radiant, unknowingly marked for death, was pinned beside a cluster of documents. Anne's gaze stayed on it, but not as a royal or as a skeptic. This time she saw a woman who had screamed for help while no one listened. A single tear slid down her cheek, surprising her. Anne was never known for such displays of emotion. She had lived her whole life with strict discipline, with measured distance, and with total unwavering control. But on this night she completely fell apart. She pressed her face into her hands and she just wept. Quiet, agonizing sobs for the sister-in-law she had so terribly misjudged. For the young woman who had walked into the lion's den with only her heart as a shield. Anne remembered brushing off Diana's fears as simple dramatics and her intensity as a sign of immaturity. But now every single letter, every video, every haunting whisper from the past proved that Diana had been more aware, more brave, and more terribly isolated than anyone ever knew. "I should have seen it," Anne whispered to herself. "I should have asked her what was wrong." The guilt settled deep inside her chest like a stone. Diana had desperately tried to raise the alarm, to speak her truth, but the institution, the media, the palace, and even Anne herself had all looked the other way. She had been branded as difficult, unstable, and attention-seeking, but she was never seeking attention. She was seeking protection for her two sons. Anne sifted through one of Diana's final letters one last time. They are relentless. They won't stop until they control everything Diana ever wrote. Not even William and Harry are safe from the corruption festering inside these palace walls. I'm not afraid for myself anymore. I'm afraid of what they will become if no one ever tells them the truth. Anne held the document tight against her chest as fresh tears fell, hot, silent, and purifying. For all the pageantry and ceremony, for all the tiaras and duties and unspoken rules, this was the one thing that had been completely missed. A mother standing against a hurricane, shielding her children with her own body. Diana was never a threat, she was the shield. As Anne collected herself, her phone buzzed sharply. She answered a secure line. Ma'am Timothy Radcliffe's voice was strained and urgent. "There has been movement." Anne went completely still. Movement where, at Lambrook Prince George's School, an attempt was made to infiltrate the grounds. Security stopped them, but it's certainly no coincidence. We think the network is now targeting the boys, starting with William's children. You must get to him immediately. The line went dead. Anne stared at the phone, her heart hammering her ribs. The danger had never actually gone away. It had simply changed its form. And this was no longer just about the past. The same dark forces that silenced Diana were now creeping towards her sons. But this time Anne refused to stand back. She was going to fight in this race against time. The second the call ended, Princess Anne was in motion. There wasn't time to use official security channels. Far too many of them had been compromised. She contacted only the people she trusted completely, starting with a retired MI5 director who once owed Diana a quiet personal favour. Within the hour, an undercover protection team was sent to Lambrook, where Prince George was still attending his classes. A second shadow team was dispatched to watch Prince Harry's location in America, knowing they were on borrowed time. She left Kensington Palace under the cover of darkness, her route obscured, and all communications scrambled. She had flash drives, original documents, and backup video footage, everything Diana had risked her own life to collect. The plan was brutally simple: expose the entire network before they had a chance to strike again. But Anne knew they wouldn't surrender quietly. They'd been in the shadows too long to let the truth win without a fight. As MI5 started to piece together the links between foreign bank accounts and high-ranking officials, Anne did what she never dreamed she would have to. She confronted members of her own family. In a private study inside Clarence House, she stood before two senior royals whose names were featured in Diana's secret reports. Their faces gave nothing away. They were perfect masks of polite civility. "You knew what she was uncovering," Anne said, her voice like ice. "And you let it happen." One of them shifted. These were matters far too complex for one woman to possibly understand. No, Anne snapped, her voice sharper than they had ever heard it. "They were crimes. And now your silence is no longer going to be enough to protect you." She placed a large folder on the table between them. "If anything happens to William, to Harry, or to their children, this all goes public. Every page, every name, every single transaction." The silence that followed was heavy enough to suffocate. One of the men finally spoke, his voice low and threatening. "You are making enemies you can't even see." "I already have," Anne replied, "and I am still standing." Meanwhile, AIM I5 teams flagged irregular movement near Prince William's private estate. An unregistered delivery van had tried to bypass the security perimeter. It was stopped, but the contents were beyond alarming. They found blueprints, surveillance photos, and tampered brakes for a car registered to a member of the household staff. This was not a simple robbery. It was a clear message. Back at Sandringham, Anne watched a live feed as George was escorted off school grounds under the highest alert. Her hands were trembling, but only slightly. They were not in the shadows anymore. The network had just made its move. An hour later, a black SUV carrying Catherine, George, and Charlotte was forced off a narrow country lane. The driver survived, but the car was completely destroyed. No serious injuries were reported, but the message was delivered loud and clear. this was not an accident. It was a warning shot. The next time they would finish what they started. Anne's face hardened as she watched the rescue crews surrounding the wreckage. This was war, and she had chosen her side. This would be Diana's final victory. The morning after the attack, Princess Anne stood at a podium in a secure briefing room with the world's press watching in a hushed, tense silence. Behind her, guarded by MI5, were sealed folders, digital archives and boxes of hard evidence, all of it extracted from Diana's secret collection. The truth was no longer buried. It was about to be unleashed. Anne took a deep, steady breath. For years we told the world a story that was incomplete. She started her voice low but unwavering. What we failed to tell you, what was kept from every single one of us, was that Diana, Princess of Wales, died not just as a symbol of charity, but as a woman on a personal mission for justice. The news sent shockwaves through the nation. Over the next few days, headlines screamed names that were once untouchable. High-ranking officials, corporate leaders, and even minor royals were either arrested or forced into resigning. Their offshore bank accounts were frozen. Investigative files, once sealed tight, were suddenly reopened. The intricate web Diana had found and Anne had exposed was finally starting to unravel. At the very heart of it all was a woman once mocked for being too emotional and too impulsive. But now Diana was vindicated. She had not died for nothing. She died protecting the truth and protecting her children. In the weeks afterward, Anne quietly launched the Diana Truth Foundation, an organisation dedicated to transparency in global charities, whistleblower protection and real investigative journalism. Its mission was simple: keep the torch lit that Diana had carried in secret. Her legacy was no longer one of tragedy but of ultimate triumph. One evening alone in her private study, Anne went back to the ornate jewellery box. After all the chaos, it had been catalogued and preserved, but she'd never fully emptied it. Her fingers brushed the velvet lining until they found a small hidden groove. Another click, a panel lifted up. Inside lay a thin cassette tape in an envelope addressed to William and Harry. "Only if the world finally hears me." Anne's breath hitched in her throat. She held it for a second, then put it in an old cassette player and pressed play. Diana's voice filled the room, soft but incredibly steady. "My dearest boys, if this message has found you, then I know you have finally heard the truth. Not just about what happened to me, but about who you are meant to be. Not symbols, not just heirs, but hearts that are able to change this world. Don't carry fear with you, carry courage instead. That's what I always tried to do. And that's what I hope you will keep doing for yourselves and for all of those who never had a voice, model." Tears streamed down Anne's face. Diana's last gift wasn't just about the truth. It was her love, timeless, unbreakable, and in the end, completely victorious. Princess Diana's final mission was never really about the fame. It was about protecting the truth and shielding her sons from a crippling legacy of royal silence. Thanks to Princess Anne's relentless quest for justice, the real story can finally be told. What was buried under crown jewels and secrecy is now a historical reckoning. Diana was so much more than a princess. She was a whistleblower, a fierce protector, and a mother who never ever stopped fighting. Subscribe for more of the untold stories that powerful people tried to erase from history. Like and share this video to keep these important voices from being silenced. Every single truth we uncover gets us closer to a future where silence no longer gets the final say. Stay tuned because the next shocking revelation is already unfolding behind those palace doors.